we're looking at individual rights and justice. This was a topic that CJ suggested. And so we're looking at, what is the purpose of government? How do we know that rights are real? And what is social justice? Is social justice a good idea? The people that typically advocate social justice, do we have some concerns with the things that they say? So let's get started with Jacob. Can you give us a little intro to why is this topic relevant, say, in April 2018?
That should be fairly obvious if you're alive right now in April 2018 and paying attention to the news cycle, especially to things going on in the evangelical world. There's a lot of emphasis on justice today in the culture and in the church, and that could be a really good thing, but the emphasis is on what everybody's calling social justice. And unfortunately, a lot of times social justice, we think, is a perversion of justice. And so we want to join with our brothers, especially in the church, in advocating for justice in society. I think that's a really good thing, and that's something that we should talk about. So there are some Christians who are fighting this social justice perversion by saying, well, let's just not focus on justice at all. Let's just focus on the gospel. I think that's a little wrong-headed. I think it's appropriate and good and maybe even mandatory for the church to be seeking justice in society. The problem is that a lot of people who are seeking to do so don't really have a very good understanding of what justice is, and it ends up corrupting the concept of justice and leading to a lot of really bad ideas that are going to compromise the gospel, I think, and also going to hurt a lot of people long term.
We should, as Christians, care about the things that God cares about. So I wanted to open up with a couple Old Testament verses that describe some of the things that are priorities to God. One is in Psalm 99:4, the king in his might loves justice. You have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. And you notice that justice and righteousness are often paired together in the Bible. And the other one is Zechariah 7:9-10. Thus says the Lord of hosts, render true judgments. Show kindness and mercy to one another. Do not oppress the widow, the fatherless, the sojourner, or the poor, and let none of you devise evil against another in your heart. So we can see through these verses that, God is saying some things that we hear a lot of the social justice warrior types saying. So it comes down to a question of what does God mean, and does he mean the same thing that the social justice warrior types mean? And that's why we get to this issue of individual rights. You'll see in Scripture, individual rights are actually talked about, which I was surprised because, the topic of rights, that's something that only came about during the time of the Roman government, really, where citizens had individual rights. But in the Old Testament, even before the Romans, you have God talking about the right of the poor, the right to their property. And what was going on is rich people would bribe a judge, the judge would do a ruling, and the ruling would say, that land belongs to me. And they would take the land away from the poor. And it's there's a huge focus in the Bible, in the Old Testament, on property rights, on the land that belongs to each person. And when we see cries of injustice from the prophets, they're saying, your worship of me doesn't even matter anymore, is what God is telling them, because you don't care about other people's rights. Huge emphasis on individual rights. So, Jacob, you've studied the issue in depth. You've looked at Tim Keller's book, Generous Justice. You've looked at how other people are explaining this topic. So can you compare and contrast what are the social justice warrior types saying versus what does Scripture say?
Sure. So what Keller does is he goes through, especially Old Testament passages that link righteousness and justice together, and there are a lot of them, like you mentioned. And he comes to the conclusion that in order to be righteous, you must seek justice in society. You have to be an advocate for justice in society in order to be a righteous person, a righteous man of God. And then he notices that a lot of the descriptions of what seeking justice is like includes advocating for the oppressed in society. So the widow, the sojourner, the poor, the poverty-stricken, And a lot of times, some of the admonitions to be a righteous person by helping those people are accompanied with admonitions for charity, or what we would call charity also. But what Keller does is he takes all of that and lumps it all together into this concept of what he calls social justice. And there's a lot of ways in which that's coming from the culture. I mean, you could call it a sort of Marxist or cultural Marxist idea of justice. I know a lot of contemporary evangelicals are sneering at the idea that, oh, this isn't Marxist. But when you fail to make the careful distinctions that we want to make here, especially between charity and justice, that does involve bringing in sort of a Marxist idea where what is deserved as justice turns into what is grounded in what somebody needs. And so the idea of contemporary social justice is that the extent to which you don't help someone's needs, regardless of how those needs came about, is the extent to which you're being unjust toward that person. You are, as Keller puts it, robbing from that person. You're a thief. You're taking what is rightfully theirs because you're not filling their need. And that really is a Marxist idea of justice. If you think about the Marxist slogan, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, that's exactly the idea behind it, that justice involves filling the needs of others. Now, the way that we would approach it, in contrast, is to say that justice is giving to each their due. And then the question is, well, what is their due? The Marxist idea is going to say, well, their due is whatever they need. And we're going to say, no, their due is whatever they've rightfully earned, or whatever they rightfully deserve, and it has nothing to do with their need. And then you can go beyond that. You can go beyond the justice of giving each their rightful due to helping them in their need, and what we would call that charity. And there's one reason that Keller says that we shouldn't call it charity. It's because it's obligatory, and charity has the connotation of it being optional. So there's all kinds of confusions and category mistakes going on here, and it actually takes a lot of careful thinking to pull it all apart. And that's just sort of a big picture. I'll let you guys ask more specific questions about all those things, because there's a lot of particular issues that go into the differences between our idea of justice and the contemporary social justice idea of justice.
Jacob, I think that's a really good overview, and I would like to open up the floor to ask, first of all, CJ, you're the one that brought up the question of what are rights? How can we think that rights are real, that there's something that's really true? How can we prove them? So that's the kind of question that we want to look at. And I think that that's our way of understanding justice in the political context versus righteousness in individually treating others charitably. So do you remember what your exact question was, CJ?
Hi, Cody. Thanks so much for bringing this topic to the forefront. It's really close to really close to my heart. Well, I guess it's let me just pose a question. And also I think what is an observation. I'm not a scholar in any sense of the word. I'm very passionate about philosophy and theology, obviously. So I read a lot. So my question might come across as naive or probably uninformed. But my perception is that there's a tendency to conflate justice with rights, jurisprudence with rights. Let me explain what I mean. When you study natural law, my understanding, especially via Aquinas, is that it was primarily concerned with what is objectively right. The pursuit of what Aquinas called the basic goods. He spoke about right courses of actions. There was a defective way to pursue a basic good, and there was a right way to pursue a basic good. So natural law was based on what was objectively good. At some stage, around the Enlightenment, through Hobbes and through Locke, for example, and through the Franciscan monk, William of Ockham, they came about the subject of individual rights, which is really not actually correlative with natural law, what is objectively right. So you have what is objectively right and subjective individual rights. They're two different concepts. And I was actually amused to see a definition in Wikipedia where natural law was actually defined in the same sentence as natural rights. The two aren't correlative. So basically, this is a long-winded way of saying I think we've got to be very, very careful not to conflate justice with rights, because not the same, chronologically, historically, or even philosophically.
Could you explain real quickly what you mean when you say subjective rights?
Well, yeah, subjective individual rights is just basically the rights now of the individual, which is distinct from the idea of natural law, which was basically an objectively right cause of action.
Sure. So there's potentially a couple different things going on here. One is the ancients, and this goes all the way back to Aristotle, had a concept of justice that is often called universal justice, which refers just to right action in general. And that sounds like what you're referring to there with Aquinas and natural law, where justice, universal in this universal sense, justice just means being a moral person, being righteous in all that you do. And that's a valid way to use the term justice. However, the medievals and Aristotle also always distinguished that concept of justice from more particular concepts of justice. So there's universal justice, which just refers to being a righteous person. But then there's more particular concepts of justice, which refer to giving someone their due or equity, things along those lines. And when we're talking about particular justice, that's where the issue of individual rights comes in, because the question is, well, what are people do? What is the objectively right thing to do in terms of the way that I treat other people? And what is the objectively right thing for the government to do in terms of arbitrating between the way people treat other people? And so individual rights come in at the level of, you could say, legal justice, in the sense of the particular justice is in regard to the legal sphere, the political sphere, is after what should the government enforce regarding what people are due. Should the government step in when someone robs you? Should the government step in when you are in need, and force money from someone else to fill that need? Those are two very different conceptions of particular legal justice, if you want to call it that. And the answer to that question might be totally different than the answer to the question if you're talking about universal justice. So for instance, universal justice, I think, would demand that you help someone who is struggling if you're able to. And this is Jesus commanding us to help the poor for the sake of the gospel, as a picture of the gospel. So universal justice does demand that we voluntarily help people who are in poverty, especially if it's at no fault of their own. But that's different than saying that particular legal justice demands that, because particular legal justice has to do with what is the proper use of force in society. What is the proper use of government on this issue?
So that takes us to a broader question, which is, what is the entire purpose of government? I think that relates to this discussion. And before we go forward, I would want to ask, anybody or more than one person, if you had to summarize in one sentence, what's the purpose of government? Do you have an answer to that question? I was especially thinking, Tony, Matt, you guys have done a lot of thought on this. You'll need to press unmute if you want to add anything. Go ahead, Matt.
I mean, I guess I'd say that I've always thought the main purpose is to protect rights. I don't know if that's too simple of a way to put it, but
I love it. Do you have thoughts on that one, Tony? I know you and I have discussed it in huge depth. Here, let me unmute you. Good to go.
Yes, I agree with Matt, to protect rights. And I don't think that's too simple, because I think once you start adding more into it, it becomes more convoluted and easily taken out of proper context. So yeah, I think staying simple with that is good to protect rights.
You know, I've heard a discussion of the U.S. Constitution because, you know, people have said, why does the Constitution seem like it's not working right now? And these scholars were looking at it, the scholars that I really respect, and one of them said, the only difference that I would make in the Constitution, the only thing I would change is right in the preamble of it. I would say the purpose of government is to protect individual rights. And here's all of the means to it. And that would help judges as they're reading the Constitution. They would help them to see, oh, that's the criteria by which I have to judge everything else and all of my interpretations.
Yeah, and it's helpful to see the Declaration of Independence as a sort of preamble to the Constitution. I mean, it's not officially, but functionally, if you look at the history, it really was. And the Declaration of Independence does spell out the principle of individual rights, and the idea that that's the proper purpose of a government. And so, you know, I wish that people, when they were reading the Constitution, would read it in light of the Declaration of Independence.
So have you guys heard challenges to this concept that the purpose of government is protecting individual rights? What are some of the objections that especially you hear from the left or from Christians on the left?
Well, you can go first, John.
Me? You want to be John?
Yeah, I think somebody else has started to talk while I started to talk. They can go first.
Okay, yeah. John's my last name. I go by CJ. So actually, what I wanted to just inject there again, you know, especially since we're talking about the Declaration of Independence, again, I mentioned earlier the distinction between what is objectively right and subjective individual rights. I want to drill down to a further distinction between natural rights, you know, negative rights versus positive rights, which is where we, you know, when we start talking about the role of government. And I totally agree with what, you know, Matt said earlier. And if you look at it historically, Thomas Hobbes, for example, with his contractarianism and his, you know, with his state of nature, that was like kind of the philosophical basis for the emergence of, you know, of positive rights. But I think when we talk about the role of the government is to protect individual rights, that distinction between negative rights versus positive rights becomes very, very pertinent. Because if we're talking about natural rights, you know, then we're talking about the role of God with regards to rights emerging as a proper cause of action to pursue a basic good. But if we're talking about positive rights, we're down to the tyranny of the majority. Basically, rights just basically means what the majority believe the rights are. And this is why you have so many, what I call dysfunctional kind of rights. Like, for example, you know, the wide array of human rights. You know, Bernie Sanders, people were popularly voting for him because he promised free education. People believe they have a right to, you know, what philosophers would call active rights, right? Mm-hmm. A right to free education, a right to free healthcare, you know, a right to affirmative action. I was amazed at what happened last week when 2 black guys were arrested in Starbucks because somehow they misinterpreted civil rights to mean that they could sit in a Starbucks without having to buy a coffee. And now they're calling for a national boycott of Starbucks, despite what I see as Starbucks bending over backwards to make amends for something which I don't think they needed to apologize, you know, for. So again, that distinction between positive rights and negative rights to me is very, very important before we can really discuss the role of government in protecting those rights. I waffled on a little bit.
Something similar to that I heard from the Senator Rand Paul. You know, he's a doctor, he's an eye doctor. And, you know, he said, if you have the right to healthcare, then that means that you have the right to come to my door and insist that I treat you. So that's a good illustration of this idea of positive rights, which I would reject. Nobody has the right to make other people do something. And I think that that's a good way of thinking about it. A negative right would be if it's morally proper for me to be left alone. That would be a negative right. It's morally proper that you cannot hit me, so I have the right not to be hit. That's how, you know, that's how I would describe negative rights.
Yeah, it's important to realize that you can't have both. The positive rights automatically and necessarily negate individual rights in terms of negative rights. You either have negative individual rights and no other rights, or there's no such thing as negative rights. So positive rights completely undercut individual rights. So the only coherent concept of individual rights is the concept of negative individual rights.
Yeah, and then we're back to the philosophical question: do those negative rights actually exist, or are they a product of what is necessary for us to live in a peaceful society?
So that's where I want to push back on when you called them subjective earlier. I want to say no, there's nothing subjective about individual rights when we think of them in terms of negative rights. So from now on, when I say individual rights, just think negative rights. There's nothing subjective about it. It's very objective, and it's grounded in the fact that man is a rational, volitional being. The way that man lives is by applying his mind to reality and working to sustain himself. And so when you introduce force into that picture, you are essentially being a murderer. You are essentially, so in order for me to live, I have to use my mind to think about reality and make a plan and build tools, build whatever it may be, hunting tools, fishing tools, if we want to go back to agrarian society. And I have to do all those things with my mind, with my body. And then as I produce, those things that I produce become an extension of myself, because I invested my thought, my energy, my time, my creativity into those things. So the tool that I produce, or the wealth that I produce, whatever it is, becomes a concrete symbol, a concrete extension of my own life. And so to take that away from me is to take away a piece of my life. It would be tantamount to chopping off a piece of my body. And so that's where especially property rights come in. If it's wrong to murder someone, then it is equally wrong to use force against them in any way to extract a value of theirs or a piece of property of theirs, because it's the same principle at play. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
It makes sense, what I would say, where I'm at right now in my research on whether, do rights, I'm actually arrogantly writing a book called Do Rights Exist? So this is something I've really, really drilled into. Based on what I've read, whether it's Rand or an interpretation of natural rights, negative rights, everything that I've read so far shows that rights are necessary, and rights are objectively a rational principle. They're a firm, rational principle. I haven't read anything which actually demonstrates that rights, negative rights, exist. There's no logical defense I've come across that show they actually exist, the way feelings or thoughts exist. There's nothing which shows me they exist as part of a law, in terms like how, for example, you have like the law, Newton's laws of motions. Even I'm sure you studied natural law. Even when Aquinas talks about natural law, it doesn't mean a law in the sense of a scientific law. It means a law in terms of the rational principles, which you very eloquently espouse. And I agree with everything that you said. I just think even when Rand says, for example, you look at Rand's logical defense of rights, my opinion, and again, I'm not a scholar, is that she showed that rights are absolutely necessary, and they can be logically deduced to affirm that they're necessary. I haven't come across anything which proves that they exist.
I guess the question is, what would you consider proof that a objective moral law exists? So whether it's regarding rights, or thou shalt not murder, or you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So I think I would say those are all objective moral laws. What would it take to prove that those objective moral laws exist in your mind?
Well, for me, when you say thou shalt not kill, to me, that's an objective moral law, because I'm a Christian. God commanded as such. You see what I mean? But I would distinguish between a law and something which was derived from a law, like rights. There's no law, in the Ten Commandments which says, thou hast rights, or thou shalt not violate thy neighbor's rights. You see what I mean? So,
Actually,
Thou
there
shalt not
is.
steal so what that's saying is there is a moral principle that you shall not steal. And we just classify that under the umbrella of, we call that a right.
I think that I might have interesting response to this, if that's all right.
Go ahead.
yeah, please.
Well, I think that, CJ brings up a very important question. Like, can you say that moral laws exist in the same sense that you can say a scientific law exists? And it made me think of a debate between a Christian and a materialist, where the materialist, said, well, can you name something that's objectively true that's not made out of matter and energy? And he said the laws of logic. And so I think that this kind of I just thought of this, so I could be totally wrong, I could be totally bonkers. So if I'm a heretic, feel free to accept it. But
We'll burn you at the stake immediately.
Oh, okay. But so my thought is this. So we have objective laws of logic that exist. Like, I've got a logic textbook here somewhere, and you go through and he talks about logical fallacies. He talks about like laws of non-contradiction, all that fun stuff. And so in the same sense, I think there is a moral law that exists, and perhaps through Romans 1, for example, people have a sense of that. Like, they have a sense that stealing is wrong. They have a sense that murder is wrong. They have a sense that, Romans 1, I don't want to pick on one particular sin, but, homosexual behavior is wrong, etc. And, you kind of see that in our society where you see that the sins that are celebrated, you kind of see this look in people's eyes and this overcompensation. But anyway, going back to what I was saying, in the same sense that laws of logic exist, I think there's laws of morality. And I think this it might get kind of into the presuppositionalism versus objectivism a little bit, and that's okay. But I think that, even an atheist knows that it's wrong to murder. Now, he might have trouble accounting for that if he's, a Darwinist within his worldview, if his neighbor is his competitor. However, he does have that sense that, it is wrong to murder, just in the same way where you can sit down and teach the atheist logic from a logic textbook. He'll know that these immaterial laws exist. I had one more comment, if that's all right. I know I was going to say something about Thomas Sowell, but a different thing I wanted to say real quick was I'm reading an older book from him, and it was interesting to see how with laws, the laws that we have in the Constitution, like the purpose of government is to protect this absolute moral law and codify it to some extent. It's wrong to murder. But you have it where on the left we have this idea of the evolving Constitution and our evolving interpretations, meaning that you have these activist judges who have been doing this for at least for I guess like a century, where they're taking these outside ideas that have nothing to do with the Constitution and reading them into the Constitution. So they might have a judge who's personally opposed to the death penalty, and whether you're opposed to that or not is beside the point. And they'll read that into the Constitution, or they'll read into the 14th Amendment that states have to accept gay marriage, or any other cause du jour. So it was interesting that you have this idea in society that you can interpret words however you want. And a lot of judges have been doing that with interpreting the Constitution with whatever it means to them, instead of what it objectively means to the people who wrote it.
Yeah, this is why objectivity is so important, including for the pursuit of justice in society. And this is where I want to agree with our fellow Christian brothers who are calling for social justice, that Christians must care about social justice, or they must care about justice in society, at least. But the problem is, if you don't have an objective worldview that insists on objectivity and on reason, then you're going to misdefine important concepts like justice, and you're going to end up advocating for injustice. And a lot of blood is going to be on your hands. A lot of suffering is going to be on your hands. And this is something that I think too many of our Christian brothers are not taking seriously enough. And
Can I ask one question about that?
Yeah.
Sorry. So we have this term social justice, and I think that before the social justice warrior movement became front page and it was in everybody's face all the time, I used to use that term here and there to in talking about getting rid of modern day slavery and having the rights of Christians to exist in communist and Muslim countries, things like that. So things that are actual social justice, because you had individual rights being taken away from a particular group, versus this kind of perversion we have where, well, because a bad thing happened to a particular black person a long time ago, by a white person, that means me, a white person, who as far as I know has no ancestors who ever owned any slaves, owes something to another black person who may or may not have ancestors who were slaves themselves, or who may have had ancestors who were slave traders. So I don't know if that made sense, but you have this, it seems like could there be a good version of social justice, and maybe what we're seeing is a perversion of a good concept?
Yes. In fact, that's why I'm going to very emphatically claim in all my writings that social justice, true social justice, is capitalism.
I like it.
Like laissez-faire, extreme, radical capitalism. And if you aren't advocating strongly and passionately for laissez-faire capitalism, then you are not an advocate of social justice. You are an advocate of social injustice. And so, at first I didn't want to use the term social justice because I was afraid of the ambiguity. But the more I think about it, the more I realize, no, that's an important term that we shouldn't give up, that we shouldn't cede to the enemy.
Jacob, if I could clarify that, when you say social justice, you mean specifically justice in regard to how people interact in a society, and especially through the government, through the state, through laws. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. If we're going to use those two terms objectively, social pertaining to society and justice, then yes, I think capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, is true justice in society.
So there's a different kind of justice that is not social justice. That would be, for instance, let's say you gave me a wonderful gift and I walked out the door and I didn't even acknowledge it. That would be an unjust action on my part. I'd be lacking gratitude, which would be the just response. That's justice of a different kind. There's no law that can tell me that I have to be grateful. But
yeah,
so there's interpersonal justice, is treating people according to their due, in ways that are outside of the legal sphere. But if we want to talk about legal justice, would you say legal justice and social justice are kind of the same thing?
So legal justice is a subset of social justice. So,
okay, explain that one.
So let me back up and say, earlier I said social justice is capitalism, properly understood. I would add, or maybe I would qualify, social justice must include capitalism, but it'll probably also include a lot of other things, like thanking people when they deserve thanks, giving honor to whom honor is due, giving respect to whom respect is due. And that doesn't include the law. But if you're going to pursue social justice, you must also pursue legal justice. Go ahead.
Is there any kind of justice that's not social justice on this scheme?
Potentially, if you want to think about justice to oneself,
okay.
Or justice to God, although there you could think of that as interpersonal also, because God is a person. Mm-hmm. So it depends on how you want to construe society and interpersonal relationships. But I would say that there is a sense in which you can be unjust to yourself and you can be unjust to God, which is the most important form of justice. But when it comes to justice in society, meaning human society, that means seeking to ensure that everyone is getting their due. and that includes legal justice, but it's going to go beyond legal justice. Does that make sense?
Mind if I throw another log on the fire here that I think will add to this? So I think, Jacob, you'll have I think a lot of people have a lot to say to this, but I mentioned Thomas Sowell earlier in the chat, and there was something he said about affirmative action that I think kind of hits the nail on the head with a lot of this. He talked about affirmative action, and that's obviously a very controversial topic. You know, a lot of white people will resent affirmative action because we're like, hey, you know, if I've earned a spot, why should somebody else who's less qualified be able to take that spot for me just because of the color of my skin? But there was something interesting that Thomas Sowell said. He pointed out in California, in the California's university system, when they got rid of affirmative action, the graduation rate for Black students went up. So you had this affirmative action was actually preventing Black students from graduating, and that didn't make sense to me at first. I didn't understand. And he went and explained why. He talked about students going to these Black students going to failing public schools, and Tom Sowell's a big advocate of charter schools. You know, he himself is African American and one of the greatest economists in the world. And so I'm sorry, guys. When he talked about this California system, he said, hey, the Black graduation rate went up after we got rid of affirmative action here. And that was interesting. He said that the reason was you had Black students who had been going to these failing schools that weren't as good, and who were smart kids, managed to get into a good university. But then they might be in the top 90th percentile, but they're being put with kids who are in the top 99th percentile. And so he himself, you know, having been when he was a professor at Cornell, like he would look out and he would actually see a lot of the Black kids in the audience who were in the classroom, I should say, who were smart kids, very bright kids, or students, I should say, not kids. And they were failing their courses because they weren't, even though they were smart, they weren't at the Cornell caliber. So they weren't in that top 99th percentile, but they were in that 90th percentile. And he said they would have been straight A students at another school that was a good school, but just wasn't Cornell or MIT or someplace like that. So I know that didn't all come out very eloquent, but I'll go ahead and put it out there.
So the way that I think that would tie in is that it gets into the issue of racism and what is racism. And I think what Thomas Sowell is putting his finger on there is what has commonly been called the racism of low expectations, where
no, I don't think it wasn't that. It was just that you had smart kids who happened to be Black, and they were being put in courses that were above their level.
Yeah,
because they had the quota.
But the motivation for affirmative action is the idea that apart from affirmative action, Blacks can't handle it. But Blacks aren't able to get into good schools apart from affirmative action.
That makes sense.
And that's why it's called racism, because it's this idea that Blacks by nature have problems with education or whatever the case may be.
Well, you know, I think one thing I want to say just very, very quickly is that I don't think it's helpful to cast affirmative action in terms of Black versus white, because my understanding, affirmative action actually includes white women and Asians. Minorities generally, it's not really a Black versus white issue. So when you say, for example, whites are resentful, that's not accurate. Perhaps white males might be resentful. But a lot of white women can benefit from affirmative action. The other thing is, one reason why Blacks might not be able to get into MIT or an Ivy League school might be implied to be their nature, but it could also be the environment. You could be the brightest person. I mean, like I had the second best high school results in Sierra Leone, West Africa, but I was in an environment which actually happens to be the poorest country in the world. So because of that, despite how bright I was within that context, it would be very difficult for someone like myself to get into Harvard or MIT. because I just wasn't in an environment that had the technology and the computers and the equipment that I could benefit from to get into a school like that. So, one reason might be implied to be a character issue, an attribute issue. Blacks are not smart, which of course is a racist view. But another could generally just be the environment. And that applies not just to blacks also, but also to whites who probably grew up in a trailer park environment, but just didn't have access to good quality education, therefore could not get into an Ivy League school.
Yeah. So, and I think what you're putting your finger on, CJ, is the fact that the way I would put it is justice requires us to be very specific when it comes to evaluating these issues, especially of, accusations of racism and things like that. And especially when it comes to inferring racism from statistics and correlations, because a correlation doesn't mean causation. And even if it does mean causation, there's still a question of what direction is the causation flowing. And maybe there's an underlying cause that's leading to the correlation that doesn't have anything to do with racism. And so there's all kinds of intricate issues going on when it comes to looking at statistics and trying to infer racism and things like that. And it's just not just to not be specific about it, to not really dig in, not only to the numbers, but into the individual cases, and to really examine, all right, do we have evidence for actual racist intentions or motivations here? Or is there potentially another reason for it? Like you said, they just happen to grow up in a poor part of the world or a poor part of the country that could have just as easily been white. Like you said, there are a lot of white people who grew up in trailer parks. And then you begin to see, okay, well, there's not really a racial component here, even though it may have seemed like it from the get-go. It's really more of a socioeconomic component. And then the question is, all right, well, how can we fix that? How should we go about fixing that? And if we're really going to care about justice, we need to make sure we keep in mind the question, how should the government go about fixing that, if it should go about fixing that at all? Is this a job for the legal system, for government, or is this a job for private action through charitable organizations and things like that? So there's all kinds of intricate, important issues that are going on in this type of issue regarding affirmative action or things like that. And I think justice demands that we get really specific and look at all of the facts. And that's something that contemporary so-called social justice doesn't want to do. That they want to just look at the big picture correlations or statistics and then jump to a bunch of conclusions from that. And when you say, hold on, let's look at the facts, let's try to be specific here before we jump to conclusions, they accuse you of being unjust. They accuse you of not caring about justice. And so that's where I think we need to push back and say, no, justice is very specific. Justice deals with facts, and facts are specific. You can't draw broad conclusions that are unwarranted and claim the mantle of justice.
When people do draw conclusions too quickly, what often ends up happening is it becomes a prescription for policy, and policies have unintended consequences. So for instance, if you were to just dump tons of handouts on any specific group of people in this country, 20 years from now, you would see that you would incentivize bad behavior, such as having children out of marriage. And 20 years later, you would see that having children out of marriage destroys a subculture. So, so there's the law of unintended consequences. But Jacob, even more on a just a higher up philosophical level, let's say you could demonstrate that a certain group of people in a culture is systematically or systemically disadvantaged because of where they grew up. From that observation alone, say it's demonstrably true, which I believe it is, does that warrant any kind of government policy that, based on their need, therefore they have a right?
No. However, it's important to say that there might be government policies that need to be altered when we notice that. So there might be a government policy that's causing that systematic generation of need among that community. And I would say, and a lot of times today, there are a lot of democratic policies typically that are well-intentioned or supposedly well-intentioned, that are causing a lot of poverty. And so there probably are policy changes that need to be made, but it's not the ones that we might automatically think of. However, let's set that aside and say maybe there's no governmental, let's just say we're in a completely free society with laissez-faire capitalism consistently across the board, and it just so happens that there's a particular group of people who are very underprivileged or underdeveloped, or however you want to put it, that systematically seem to be in poverty. The question then is, should the government step in? Does the government have a role there? And I think that's what you're getting at, Cody. And the answer is no, because of what we talked about justice earlier when it comes to legal justice, and the idea that a need does not give you a legal right. Being in need as such does not give you a right to the property or the help of others. And this is really important for Christians especially to grasp. If you guys haven't read my article that I recently wrote, The Theological Problem with Tim Keller's So-Called Social Justice, I'd really highly recommend it. This is essential to the gospel, because Keller's idea of social justice, especially when it comes to economics, is that a need generates a right. So if somebody or a group of people is in need, then that generates an obligation on your part to fill that need, and it generates a right on their part for your property. So the idea of justice here is from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. Now step back as a Christian and think about if we applied that concept of justice to the gospel, to God. God is infinitely able, and we are infinitely needy in respect to him. If this concept of justice were true, then we would have a right to divine help, to divine aid. We would have a right to salvation. We would have a right to heaven. And yet that flies in the face of the gospel, because the gospel says you don't have a right. You deserve hell. But this social justice idea, this idea of justice according to need, would say, no, what I deserve is for my needs to be fulfilled. And so on this idea of justice, we would be claimants against God. We would get to go to God and say, God, you owe me infinite grace. It wouldn't be called grace then. It would be called justice. But you owe me heaven. And if you don't pay up right now, then you're unjust, God. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, it brings the gospel into focus and says, I hope I'm not talking too much on this chat today, but I think that brings the gospel into focus and says, Jesus went to the cross because he wanted us. He didn't have to. Like, there was no, yes, you have Jesus submitting to the Father, but there was no higher authority above God. There was no super God, telling God to step in and fill this need that we had.
I think a better way to put it is he didn't owe us anything. Right?
So,
because that's this idea of justice. This idea of justice is not so much that that there's a higher being commanding us to do it. It's that the fact that I am in need means that you have to help me.
yeah.
And if we apply that to God, then the idea would be that the fact that we were in need demands that Jesus help us, that he owes us. And that's exactly the opposite of the gospel. Jesus owes us nothing. God owed us nothing. Him sending his son was an act of grace, and grace means undeserved favor. Very emphatically, undeserved. That's super emphasized throughout the entire New Testament. We did not deserve it. God did it as a grace to us, as a mercy, as a gift. And so we have to think of helping other people when they don't deserve it in the same way. They don't deserve it. If I'm going to help someone who's poor, and I want that to be a picture of the gospel, the most important thing I need to do is not pretend that they deserve it. Because if I pretend, so let's say, just say Greg, not to pick on you, let's just say you're in need. You know, maybe you've fallen behind on your bills, whatever the case may be, you've got a need, and you come to Cody or I and say, hey, could you guys help me out? If I want that to be a picture of the gospel in helping you out, it very emphatically needs to be the case that I do not help you pretend that you deserve that gift. You should not think that you deserve it from us, and we should not help you pretend that you deserve it from us. It should be very clearly understood, this is a gift. You don't deserve it. This is grace. This is mercy. It's undeserved. And that's the exact opposite of the message that people like Tim Keller are giving when they talk about so-called social justice being rooted in needs rather than in desert.
So I guess throughout, again, I hope I'm not asking too many questions, but I wanted to come back to that school thing later, but so I don't get off topic. What would you say to I mean, we look at the Bible, and it seems like throughout the Bible we're told to give to the poor. I mean, in the Old Testament there was this interesting welfare system, you know, where you didn't like plow like the outside edge of your land when you harvest your grain or whatever. And in the New Testament you have Jesus saying, like, whatever you did not give to the least of you know, this poor person, you chose not to give to me. So obviously there is a huge emphasis in the Bible of helping the poor and, you know, doing that sort of thing. So how would we square that with you know, what's being said here?
Yeah, so the really important question is, so we agree with Keller and the other Christian advocates of so-called social justice that it's not optional for the Christian to help the poor. It's not optional. We agree there. It's obligatory. The question is, what generates the obligation? Is it their need? And the answer has to be no, because that contradicts the gospel. So then the question is, what does generate the obligation? And I would say that God's command generates the obligation. We owe it to God to picture forth his mercy by being merciful to the poor. But you contradict that if you call it justice rather than mercy. So yes, you have to picture the gospel in giving to the poor. You have to do that as a Christian. You have to seek the good of other people in order to paint a picture of the goodness of God to us. That's required. That's obligatory. But in order to do that, in order to actually paint a picture of the character of God, you can't call it justice. You have to call it grace. You have to call it charity. You have to call it mercy. You have to very emphatically say, this is not deserved. You have to say to the recipient, you don't deserve this. I'm giving it to you as an act of charity because I want your good, the same way that God gave his son to us as an act of grace for our good and ultimately for his glory.
What you just said, Jacob, that really helps us understand how to understand the gleaning law in the Old Testament and the provision for if there's a foreigner that you need to treat him well, those kinds of things. Those are not obligatory because of the need. They're obligatory because of the purpose of God in establishing the nation of Israel as his representatives.
Yeah, and showing forth his character. He says over and over again throughout Scripture that he is the God who lets the rain fall and the sunshine on his enemies. He's showing his mercy. He's not saying, you're not my enemies and you deserve this rain and this sun, and that's why I'm giving it to you. He's saying, no, you don't deserve it, and yet I give it to you because I'm that merciful, because I'm that bountiful in grace and mercy. And he wants his people to picture that forth in grace and mercy to other people. But in order to do that, you have to very emphatically say that it's undeserved.
And can you imagine the trouble that you have when Christians vote to impose laws on a nation that is significantly non-Christian, that requires those non-Christians to be doing these things that Christians should be doing by choice, Christians forcing other people to do it. It's a total inversion of justice.
And I feel like that also, I think that also, when you have welfare programs, as somebody who has been on a, I've had food stamps and, stuff like that before myself. And I'm like, it really is demoralizing, and it's not a good system. I mean, just even if all these social welfare systems worked, and even if they worked well, there's just something about them that's demoralizing. You're taking the joy of giving away from the giver, and you're taking the humblingness away from the person who is receiving, because then you're just getting this check from the government that was owed to you, because you were forced to pay into this bizarre insurance policy.
This
And,
concept of owed is so
yeah.
important.
And that's why I put it in quotes.
Yeah, to tie it back to kind of what's going on recently, April 2018, when we recently had the Gospel Coalition, the ERLC of the Southern Baptist Convention hosted the MLK 50 conference. When we had Together for the Gospel, which was sort of like Together for the Social Gospel, just last week. Let me show you, just to compare our understanding to some other people's understanding. This is a tweet. The ERLC did a great thing. They raised $1 million for a scholarship initiative to help connect minority students. This is voluntary, right? Help connect minority students with Christian schools and seminaries. So then somebody said, oh, that's great. This is where it's at. White evangelicalism, if it wants to become a true ally to Black community, it must begin investing financial resources owed back to it. It must begin not only by giving its word, but action through financial investment into Black saints. So he took something that was very good, financial investment into Black saints, which would be wonderful as a mission initiative. And he said it was owed. And that ought to be very disturbing.
Yeah, it completely flips the gospel on its head, like I said earlier. And if we take that view of rights seriously and integrate it into the rest of society the way that these people want to, I think you get very disastrous, horrific results. You belittle the imago Dei. You belittle what it means to be a man, because you belittle the significance of property and the fact that property is an extension of one's life. You belittle the recipient by belittling their manhood, their humanity, and treating them as a needy animal that can only survive through the gifts of others, and who is incapable of being self-sufficient in themselves. So that there's all kinds of ugliness and dehumanizing that goes on when we start to apply that concept of justice and ownership in the rest of society. And you can see that very clearly in the countries that have implemented that concept of justice as consistently as they could in communist and socialist regimes. And you can argue that, some of those, they were never true communism or whatever the case may be, but there's no denying that they were at least trying to implement that same idea of justice, that same idea of ownership, where it's based on need rather than based on value creation and production.
I see, Tony, you had your hand raised, and also there was a comment from Colin. He says, if rights are based on needs, then rights can come and go as needs come and go. Rights by nature are absolute. God has woven them into the fabric of reality, and they cannot come and go. Thus, rights cannot be based on need. Tony, go ahead. What were you going to add there?
I have a question just for slight clarification. When we're talking about justice, and I really like the distinction of justice versus grace and mercy, and that it may be grace and mercy that we're looking for and mislabeling it as justice. But would it be correct to say that mercy is withholding punishment and grace is the giving of something, and therefore social justice in the way that we're talking about it would more correctly align with grace rather than mercy? or is that or yeah, so should we be using the word grace rather than mercy more often when we're talking about proper social justice?
Yeah, I think so. There have been a lot of discussions about the potential distinctions between the concept of mercy and the concept of grace, and what you just described is the most popular distinction. However, there also seems to be somewhat of a consensus that it's a blurry line, and so I wouldn't want to draw too sharp of a distinction. I would just say, you know, you could probably use the terms interchangeably, and you know, in social interactions, it might be more helpful to just use the term charity. But the important thing, as you pointed out, I think, is that we don't use the concept of justice.
All right, guys, I noticed that we're on the hour, so we're going to wrap up the recording, and I'm going to turn the recording off.
Before you
go
do
ahead.
that, mind if I throw out one other thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just because I know people are going to watch on YouTube, and I know we're going to get, you know, people who are, you know, open but might, you know, have a even a hostile perspective. I think it's important when we talk about, you know, different social justice programs and things like that. One thing I think that people, especially who might be a bleeding heart liberal, and not everybody who's a bleeding heart liberal is bad, obviously, as a person, but it was pointed out, like, again, Thomas Sowell points out that human beings don't like to see other human beings suffering. You know, so, you know, just because we're, you know, more, you know, maybe right wing doesn't mean that we, you know, don't care about that person over there who's living in poverty. Almost talking about what CJ said with, you know, environment, what Thomas Sowell points out a lot, like one thing he's a big advocate for is charter schools and school choice. And ultimately, I think I would personally like to see the government someday out of schools and out of education entirely, and to have real, true school choice. But when you have it where you have these failing public schools, these failing ghetto schools, and people say, oh, well, they don't get enough funding. A lot of times they get more funding than the affluent suburb schools. And when you allow school choice, when you allow these kids to take 70% of the budget, so say they're getting $10,000, say if they could take $7,000 and go to a private school or a charter school instead, those same kids from those same ghetto neighborhoods are doing just as well as the richest kid in the most affluent suburban school. And so, like, some people out there will try to argue for a genetic racism, or they'll try to argue for, you know, all kinds of things. But it is very interesting that you'll have a poor black kid and a rich white kid, and the poor black kid will do just as well, if not better, than that rich white kid if those parents are just allowed to pick where they send their kid to school. And it just amazes me that liberal politicians, including Barack Obama, are so opposed to school choice. And, you know, I don't want to assume nefariousness, but I mean, if you keep people poor, you have to keep them on welfare, you keep them voting Democrat. So a lot of Democrat politicians have been opposed to school choice, which is raising poor black kids out of poverty, and giving them a future and giving them, you know, choice on where they go with their life.
Yeah, and that gets back to the point that we should want to seek social justice. We should want to seek justice in society. And there are parts of society that have injustice. And one of those is education. And the way that the educational system right now is set up to hinder people from succeeding. That's unjust. That's something that we as Christians should seek to dismantle in the name of social justice or justice in society. So the question is not, do you seek justice in society? The question is, what does that look like? What does that imply? And the quote unquote leftist side of the aisle has a completely different idea of what justice demands in society than what we do. And we need to stop granting them the claim of being a social justice warrior and start challenging their concept of justice. We need to say that they are a social injustice warrior. They want injustice in the school system. They want injustice in race relations. They want injustice in all these different areas of society and of economics. What we want is justice. And that's what we need to do. We need to fight to reclaim the concept of justice, and then start to spell out, here's what justice actually looks like, and here's how we can actually help people with true justice.
There were a couple people that had raised a hand. Let's go ahead with Ruben. Here, let me unmute you, Ruben. There you go. I'm not hearing your sound. I hear you now.
All right. Sorry if it's loud here. It's just one of the things that I wanted to point out that it's very hard, and this often gets missed, is that the identification that someone has with someone who looks like them. So, for example, take the folks that are in South Africa. Thank you so much. The folks that are in South Africa that have having their rights stripped away from them by having their property taken and distributed to others. Right. This is very, very wrong. It's a serious injustice. And for those that can identify with how those people look, it feels a lot more personal, because the thought comes, that could have been me, or this could be me. And that comes to the point with me when it comes to immigrants, illegal immigrants in the country. Which I believe is wrong, and we need to find a right way to handle it. But at the same time, I think it's important that the people that are advocating for actual biblical justice and for charity, we have to be careful not to forget compassion in how we present that, because it can often burn a bridge with that people group. You know what I mean? And that's where I kind of think there becomes a growing hostility towards those that don't look like them. Because now they're seen or viewed as an enemy. Whether or not that's right or not is kind of besides the point. Once you get to that situation where you feel like this could be me, and here's someone who all they want to care about is justice. Now I agree with you guys, and I agree completely with justice in a biblical standpoint. I just want to make sure that aspect doesn't get lost.
There's a place in Galatians where Paul writes, it's Galatians 6:10, as we therefore have opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially unto those who are of the household of faith. And nobody can read the New Testament without feeling the way you're describing, Ruben, about the need to help others, the need to have compassion on others.
Yeah, and let me one up you and say, I think justice demands that every individual person think that could have been me when someone is oppressed, regardless of what they look like. Because justice demands that you think of yourself and of other people as individuals rather than part of a color collective. Or, the Mexicans aren't fundamentally different than Anglos, or, however you want to break it up. They're individual human beings, just like I'm an individual human being. And if there is an unjust principle or an unjust idea going on in society that's oppressing those people, or even one particular person, I'm just as much threatened by that as that person is, because injustice ultimately doesn't discriminate. It might in the short term, but if it's consistent, it will threaten the lives of everybody in the long term. And that's why this is so important to think in principle, especially when we think about things like justice. It's a universal thing that applies to every individual human being. This isn't an issue of collective groups warring against each other. That's unjust. We need to really radically alter our thinking and think of other people as individuals rather than as pieces of a collective.
Tony, I noticed you had your hand raised. Was there something you wanted to point out there?
So does CJ.
I was just stretching.
Oh, okay. Here, I'm going to press the button. CJ, go ahead.
I think Jacob makes a very, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I think Jacob makes a very, very good point. And as a black guy in America, I'm kind of disadvantaged. I tend not to agree with the black collective. I just want to refer back again to what happened with the Starbucks, incident. When two black guys went into Starbucks, weren't going to buy, they were asked to leave, so they weren't going to leave. The police were called and they were arrested. I think calling the police was an overreaction, but I also think the blacks were unreasonable in not leaving when they were asked to leave. Starbucks came out and the CEO personally met with the two black guys. Starbucks are closing all their stores across the nation for a whole day to teach, racial diversity. Despite that, there are blacks out there that are still calling for a national boycott of Starbucks. So the point I'm trying to make is that, rich lives matter. And we shouldn't underestimate, as we talk about mercy and we talk about helping the weak and the poor, we shouldn't also underestimate the power that the weak and the poor have to use the ballot to oppress the strong. So when I use the hashtag, the tyranny of democracy or the tyranny of majority, I see that happening so often. And as an objective, rational person, regardless of color, it really, really offends me. Now, when we talk about, for example, the weak, we show mercy and we give. Remember, the weak are also able to use the ballot to enforce something which is fundamentally immoral from my point of view as proportional taxation. Yes. So as we come from a place of benevolence, we also need to understand that there's actually really a very, very real war out there where people, the reason why I distinguish between in natural rights, negative rights versus positive rights, is because the majority, through tyranny, can shape positive rights to their advantage. Another quick thing, and I'll shut up, is that the reason why I push back about the idea of an objective natural law is because whilst we do have an objective natural law, unfortunately, it's interpreted by subjective humans. Point in case, Aquinas used natural law to defend slavery. Abraham Lincoln used natural law to abolish slavery, So this is what we're dealing with here, where we say, yes, we serve a God that has come up with an objective law, but we're still subject to individuals on both sides of the aisle interpreting in a subjective sense towards what is they consider to be in their best interest or the interest of their collective.
Yeah, and that's why it's really important to think very carefully about natural law and objective morality. I think obviously we would all say Aquinas got it wrong. He erred badly in trying to justify slavery through natural law. And we can make similar errors, and we need to be aware of that and be on guard against that, individually and as a church. And that's why it's important to have a very close attention to facts and objectivity, and not to get lost in emotions and in the national narrative and other things like that, because I think that's how you end up making mistakes and thinking that you're doing natural law, you're doing social justice, and in reality you end up corrupting those things. So it's very important to be facts oriented, to be trying to be objective, even if we're going to make mistakes. The point is we need to have objectivity as our goal, and fight the temptation to be subjective or to give into narratives of the societal fabric, things like that.
One of the best things that philosophy helps us do is to think in principle. And what we would just ask anybody on any issue, epistemology, ethics, politics, can you point to principles? And can you, when challenged, hey, this looks like a contradiction in your understanding. How can you affirm both of these things at the same time? Can you explain how your principles work? I think that's what's missing from a lot of the dialogue. I wanted to point out that this is something that Colin mentioned. Rights are necessary for each individual person to live. They are also necessary for God's plan to be able to be fulfilled for each individual person. You don't know what that plan is going to be. And so, Colin says, since rights facilitate purpose and function, God has given each individual a purpose for living. Thus, he has given each individual specific absolute rights to facilitate that purpose.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the major things that we need to recover as a church, is the idea that when you violate someone's individual rights, you are violating the image of God in them. You are violating an image of God and waging war against the God of the universe and his intentions for that person. That it's it's an extremely despicable and evil crime, the kind of which cannot justify the ends, whatever the ends may be, even if the ends are supposedly well-intentioned.
All right, guys, it's a good time for us to wrap up. I'm going to turn off the recording. I wanted to mention to anybody that's watching this later on, you can find these recordings at patreon.com/FTNCI. And thank you for watching. And we would love it if you consider supporting our ministry. And if you're a patron, you can become part of this philosophy club as well. Thank you. And definitely check out our website and our podcast at christianintellectual.com. God bless.